Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast, presented to you from the Western Cape Pod Bunker, located here in the heart of Cape Town, South Africa. This pod is presented to provide a platform and a voice for built environment professionals and interest groups who are working towards transforming the places and spaces here in South Africa. It is dedicated to those individuals and community groups that are supporting both the formal and informal processes that are shaping our cities and our spaces. For most of us, a house is the most significant asset we can own. This is particularly amplified in the lower income property owning urban households, where the affordable housing market offers significant wealth creating potential for beneficiary households. However, in this particular market, the ability of those same households to realise value from their housing assets is frequently and significantly hampered by a number of challenges. In this episode, we consider some of those challenges and what is preventing households from realising their true worth and their true value. Our guests in this Talking Transformation episode are Ilana Melzer, the Engagement Manager at 71.4, and Kessia Rust, Executive Director and Founder for the Centre for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa, or the CAHF. You're going to hear it referred to in the episode as CAF. Their insights and expertise of the South African housing markets and more broadly the continental trends and challenges force us to look at some of the preconceptions of value and worth of the housing products and asset value in the lower income households and communities typified by the RDP, or Reconstruction and Development Programme, housing products that have come onto the market since 1994. They also share their frustration with the, at times, systemic challenges facing large numbers of households who have benefited from the RDP programme. You'll also get to hear about the Transaction Support Centre in Khayelitsha, Cape Town, how it came into being and how it's dealing with some of those challenges head-on a daily basis. In a period of sustained flatlined economic activity in the country, Ilana and Kessia argue with facts and anecdotes that this is a burgeoning economic centre which is frequently misunderstood, systemically under-resourced and often ignored. It's a masterclass from two of South Africa's leading practitioners on housing and property markets, and as always, we hope you'll enjoy the episode. So it's a Wednesday afternoon, we're here in the Cape Town CBD, and our guests are Ilana Melzer from the 71.4 and Kessia Rust, Executive Director and Founder of the Centre for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa. I think, Kessia, you're down for a conference. Welcome, and thank you very much for spending some time with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Ilana, many thanks for hosting us today. Much appreciated.
Thank you for coming.
And I'm joined today by Kathy Stone. Kathy Stone is joining us to discuss the whole question today around the question of asset value, the whole question of affordable housing, how the asset value issues are being addressed within the South African context. Kathy, welcome.
Thank you, Pete.
How do we kick off a conversation around the question of affordable housing markets, and asset value? How would you go about describing, Kessia, the whole question of a problem statement? Where do we start from?
Sure. I mean, we've been looking at affordable housing and the question of affordable housing since the beginning of democracy. And South Africa has a very strong and significant subsidized housing program, and they've been delivering now. The minister said on Monday that they've delivered 4 million housing opportunities across the country. I'm not so sure about that number, but it's a lot. And is that actually addressing the breadth of the need in the market? So one of the things that we talk a lot about is that there's a government subsidized property market. There's a long waiting list for that. People wait for a long time. The rate of delivery isn't at the scale that continues to be demanded. And then they talk about the gap market, those households who earn too much to afford, to qualify for a government subsidized house, and too little to afford the cheapest newly built house. So that's something that we've been looking at for a long time, is how to fill in that gap. What do you do with a gap? It's almost, 30% of the population? That would be working class housing. And for a long time, our policy didn't address that very well. What we're very interested in CAF is working property markets, where you have an astonishing supply side program that's delivered housing in South Africa over the last 25 years, But how have they then integrated into what was already a vibrant property market for high-end properties? And how do you turn those two distinct markets in policy terms into something that you look at as one whole market, which has a very clear set of rungs that becomes a ladder where people can use property to improve their asset wealth and improve their position over time.
Ilana, from your side, the work that 71.4 does is looked quite a lot at some of the statistics and the data around these issues. Anything you'd like to add in sort of framing this problem statement with some of the big numbers that you've come across?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the key things is that we'd like to be looking at more numbers. So Cassia and CityMark and CAF have been publishing data, but there's a lot more that should be tracked. Governments publishing some data doesn't always align the different data sources. There are lots of things we can't explain in the data. So I think more of those big numbers would be very, very helpful.
I mean, the whole question, I guess it used to be the 1 million, the 2 million, 3 million. Now, as you say, we're up to, accordingly, 4 million housing opportunities. So that's not units that we've built, Kessia. That's a whole range of things about the opportunities where people have been received title deeds or whatever from their previous housing that was before 94, etc. So, I mean, these are the big numbers, I guess, that we often are churned out.
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult because it's remarkable actually that we don't know exactly how many houses we've built. That shouldn't be so hard to count. But we don't, and partly that's because of the way in which those numbers are tracked. The money that you put in, and then do you count housing starts? We don't count housing starts. We don't count housing completions. We don't publish that data. Ilana just did an excellent paper for us on looking at counting houses. And the reason we want to do that, the reason it actually matters, is not because we're checking up to see are those numbers correct, but we want to see how they perform and do they start to participate in a market. So once you allocate a house, South Africa is unique on this continent as a country that does do that, allocate a house and give it away for free, and we've been doing that now for 25 years. Well, does that actually turn into the asset that we've promised it would be? And in order for it to turn into the asset, the way a house performs would be in terms of improving someone's, their household balance sheet, their financial value as a household. They could use a house and use it to leverage mortgage finance, for example. That's one way. They might run a business from it. That's another way in which it could perform as something that would earn them some income. And then, of course, it's the shelter. And we seem to be emphasizing shelter and de-emphasizing the performance of that house in the economy. That then actually has a real impact on the ability of the housing sector itself to produce more units. It's a whole ecosystem. And the way in which the houses that the government developed are how they perform in a market then changes the demand and supply parameters up the ladder.
I think that's what's struck me as the really interesting part of the work that you guys have done. In the sense that you're right, I think there's always been a discourse around asset creation, asset building in the housing sector, but in truth, the whole delivery modality has been around service delivery and meeting basic needs and improving livelihoods. There hasn't been a lot of gearing around what is the potential for this housing delivery program to feed into a secondary market. And this is where I have certainly found the work and research and contributions that you make absolutely fascinating, because we talk about these gaps in the housing ladder, and most planners or municipal practitioners understand what the ladder is, but then there's this notion that there are these kind of insurmountable gaps between the different markets. And what in my sense is, from what you've shown us, is that actually the stock is there. So there isn't necessarily a gap in the stock. There's a gap in the way to unlock that stock into the secondary market to try and start. And the way you guys have described that kind of process, I think would be really fascinating to share on this podcast, because it certainly gives one a sense that actually there's a lot of potential to take a different way of looking at this market, and all the ingredients are there.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if I could just take us back just a couple steps, and think first about we have an overall property market that exists. We've got about, 6.3 million or so residential properties on the deeds registry. And if we look at those and the composition of those, what we've done is we've taken that data and segmented it just into 4 very simple segments. So houses that are worth less than 300,000 Rand is the entry market. And then houses that cost between 300 and 600,000 Rand would be your working class market. Then you've got the conventional market, which houses costing between 600,000 Rand and 1.2 million. And then houses that cost more than 1.2 million would be the high-end market. That's what you read about in the Sunday Times, the high-end market, right? That's in the property section. And when we first did this, when Ilana and I first started looking at this, it was about 10 years ago. And we said naively we wanted to buy deeds registry data for all properties that cost less than 500,000 Rand at the time is when we looked at it. And we didn't think it was going to be that much because we thought that was such a small segment of the market, and it was enormous. But we didn't see, so we bought these deeds records and suddenly we had them, and that started a whole other project that we followed. But when we looked at that, it was such a significant number of properties that we weren't seeing in the Sunday Times.
Understood.
Because people weren't selling them. The whole time we've been talking
formal space.
They weren't selling them in the Sunday Times, and the Sunday Times is what you look at.
Yeah.
And the whole conversation around housing supply and the gap market in South Africa was a new build conversation. The government was completely stressed because they couldn't build enough houses to meet the demand. And that was and it takes a long time to build a house, and these days a whole lot longer than it used to, right? It takes years. And then in the private sector space, you found developers who were building for a market that they assumed would be able to buy, and they weren't able to find buyers. So entry-level units, the cheapest newly built house, we just launched our yearbook, and I think it's about 420,000 Rand is the cheapest newly built house built by a private sector developer this year. Well, how much do you have to earn to be able to afford that on a mortgage? I'm guessing about 18,000 Rand or so, if there's no subsidy attached to that. So you've got households earning less than 3.5 that get a house for free, and then households who are in 18 plus or so who would be able to buy a new house. And all those houses in the middle, what are they going to buy?
So that's the gap that is talked about.
That's the gap. That's about 30% of the market, more or less, right? And when we looked at the deeds registry data, we were astonished. I was astonished to see just how much property there was there. So what was happening to it? And why wasn't it selling? Or why was I not seeing it being sold? There was a lot of conversation about informal transactions, and politicians talk about that all the time and bemoan the fact that people are selling informally. And we really wanted to understand that properly. We only had anecdotal evidence. And so to try and understand what is happening in that market where you've got a significant segment of the population and you've got a whole lot of properties, how are they interacting? And that's what Ilana was looking at then.
Ilana, do you want to come in on that side?
Yeah, I think, just to speak to the point, Kathy, that you were making about housing being service delivery as opposed to an asset. I think the best evidence for that is the title deed backlog. If government really was serious about housing, the housing program as part of, I suppose, a land reform issue, which has been really highlighted in the presidential sort of land reform panel report, that a land reform lens is what is really required in the housing subsidy context. Critically in that would be secure tenure and titling. And interestingly enough, I know there are a lot of academics, a lot of people who might say that, individual title is not what poor people need, but in our transaction support centre, no one's coming in and asking for family title or any other kind of titling system. People want their title deeds. People understand the security that it provides in law to have a title deed, and they really want that. And a lot of our work now in the transaction support centre is trying to find those title deeds, which is just, there's some official sitting somewhere who's sitting on boxes of title deeds, or they just have never been deeds of sale signed on projects where people have been living in houses for years. So how do we make that a priority? I think the whole title restoration program is something, we're watching closely and would love to support. So I think those issues, at a minimum, are critical.
Because I mean, in the absence of that title deed, Ilana, your ability to transact and use the property as an asset going forward is completely frustrated, right?
Yeah, it really is, and obviously for the household that's very problematic. But from the city, it's also a disaster because, you know, how do you send a bill for services to a household where there is no registered property owner and there is no, in the city of Cape Town, business partner associated with the property? So we just had a case where we're trying to sort out a primary transfer for a client on a project that was, you know, done years ago. She bought informally, and she got a letter of demand from the city, not addressed to anyone, but put in her post box for 42,000 Rand that she needs to come up with by the 8th of November. And, you know, trying to engage with city officials to say, look, okay, she does have 3 rental properties, she should be paying for water, but can we come to some arrangement? Well, they can't negotiate with her because she's not the property owner. So it just has disastrous consequences from a revenue perspective for the city.
Who is the property owner?
The property owner is the Housing Development Agency in this particular case. Of course, the occupant is responsible to pay the water bill, but to unwind this and to regularise this transaction is going to take a long time. We've been trying to do this since April, actually. You know, and in the meantime, no rates account, no revenue for the city. So the whole magic of a city just doesn't work.
The governance framework's broken, right?
Doesn't work. Yeah.
And this is not unique to Cape Town, right? This is a countrywide issue we're talking about.
Yeah, I would imagine it's actually probably a lot better in Cape Town than it might be in other municipalities.
The downside is we don't really know because the government has recognized there is a title deeds backlog. You know, they sent out, and maybe I can just put a couple numbers to it. So we said there may be 4 million housing opportunities. There might be, 3 million houses. We're not entirely sure. We applied a proxy on the deeds registry data and we were able to find 1.88 million government subsidized properties that we think are so on the deeds registry. They're not explicitly recognized or flagged as that, but using the proxy, we're pretty sure that's how many we found. Then the National Department says somewhere in the order of, I think it's 1.1 million properties that they believe don't have title deeds. So what are the numbers?
Yeah, I mean, the published numbers are closer to 850,000.
Okay.
But every time we mention those numbers to officials, they look at us and go, well, I've no idea where those numbers come from. So I think the whole administration side of the program has really let a lot of people down. And in part, that's because the program is a very ambitious program. I mean, 3 million houses is an achievement
for sure
of note. And I think that's the difficulty of kind of acknowledging that significant progress has been made, really significant progress. Even that household who doesn't have a title deed, who is living in adequate shelter, that is a significant improvement. But at the same time, we should be doing a lot better. And the process of kind of getting to the point where you can regularize that basic, sort of creating that basic governance system is not simple. So there is a big mess, and you've got to clean it up house by house.
It's interesting because when government worked it out a while ago, it was a few years ago, that they said, yeah, we've got a title deeds problem, and they started this whole title deeds restoration program, and that seemed to be like such a great success that they recognized that and they put some money to it and they said they were going to invest in doing it. But it's such a complicated process and it's been so slow that the numbers that they've achieved, you have the numbers, okay? Title deeds transfer.
I mean, these are numbers that the Auditor General will not sign off on, you know, in various annual reports of the Human Settlements Department. So it's very difficult to know, and certainly, you know, given the volumes that are being claimed, I would imagine we would have seen significant delays in transfer coming through the deeds office. You know, if another 270,000 title deeds went through in 1 year, you're not picking that up in city mark data.
Can't.
So it just, we don't really know, and I think that speaks to the point about just the data, the basic data that we really don't have.
You know, what this also talks to is another aspect of the work you're doing, which you mentioned earlier, Casey, around the private sector, finance sector, and their participation. So there's a lot of chat about housing policy moving into a space that is far more open to trying to get other players in the housing market to participate in the lower end of the market, and trying to figure out how to build those kinds of partnerships and try and get, I guess there are some that believe the subsidies, the housing subsidy program in a sense crowded out the private sector, but there's a recognition now that how do we open up those. And I think what your work also demonstrates is this wicked problem. If we cannot sort out these title deed issues, the scope for, and it does seem to me from the work, and perhaps you can tell us a bit about that there are people in the organizations, institutions in the private sector who actually are interested in financing households or even micro developers in these township economies and the property market, but that is in a sense being artificially constrained by this challenge. Is that
right? I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it takes enormous effort to regularize a property, and it's a very celebratory moment when we actually do get a title deed on property. I think in addition, it's not just the titling, just the general governance issues that are very absent in low-income areas. Things like submitting building plans, relatively uncommon, and then a bank considering granting a mortgage on a property that has a title deed but has a structure on the property which has not been signed off by the city, they won't do that. So then the process of trying to regularise the built structure, and how do we do that? So in engaging again with the sort of city office near the transaction support centre in Khayelitsha, I mean, they're completely overburdened. I think they've got a staff complement of 48 people and they service 280 or 250,000 households, and most of their effort has to be directed towards new build, towards new projects. So the ability of inspectors to monitor what's going on and then to regularise once they have identified some kind of activity that needs planning authorisation is very limited. It's very limited. So I think all these issues really make it quite difficult. And then I think just getting that sort of the norm of how do property owners consider themselves with respect to the city, and who do they see as the governing entity for what decisions, that sort of getting across to a citizen that the city can provide the following services and you need to comply with the following requirements. I think that process might also not be working terribly well in some neighbourhoods.
So you're almost talking about the concept of sort of citizenry. This is what the city can do for you, but there's the flip side of the coin is what is it that you are able to sort of pay back into that space.
For sure. And I think this whole, and maybe it's just like a pipe dream, but the idea of formalising street committees and neighbourhood or area committees into ratepayers associations that are officially recognised by the city, that are somewhat democratically elected, I think that's part of the process. I mean, what we're seeing in one of the pilot studies that we're doing is that, the local area leadership in that particular place is not democratically elected, but does have power precisely because they're the only ones in the area who have the phone number of city officials, and no one has a title deed. So anyone who wants a title deed needs to accord a little bit of respect to these community leaders because they're the only guys who are engaging productively with the city. So just getting those mechanisms working, and I don't think it's insurmountable. And I think we saw that in Khayelitsha. I think what the work that DAG did on backyard rental, for instance, and the discussions with city officials who were working in that area, who were encouraging households to submit plans, and the plans were coming through.
Sure.
And the city officials were engaging with them and signing them off, and it seemed like you could get it going. And Khayelitsha, I mean, we're seeing that market really, really move. So,
can you describe that? Ilana,
Yeah.
Describe that if you get it working, if you get that system working, what happens to the housing market? Because I think that potential is what's really exciting about.
Yeah. Well, I think that is something that we see. I mean, if you drive in the area of the Stocks and Stocks buildings, which is the city management, sort of the city hub in Khayelitsha, you see significant investment in housing. And it is not, it's not haphazard. Plans are being submitted for approval. The building quality is outstanding. You see a lot of backyard rental development. I mean, the rentals that landlords will be getting on decently structured, decently built structures, it's 2,500 Rand a room. That's in in Makaza, where our transaction support center is, we went to visit a landlord recently. I mean, that's real rental. He built 10 units. So he had an RDP property, demolished the property and built 10 rental units.
Just leveraging his asset.
Completely leveraging it, and used his own savings, but he'd now like to do this more with bank finance. So to get that going, there is an enormous market. So the backyard rental market is enormous. So the demand for housing, I mean, the properties move very, very quickly. So, and the prices, 250,000 Rand, we're lucky if we find a house for 250,000 Rand in Khayelitsha.
Yeah. Wow.
Tell me, how did the transaction center in Khayelitsha come about?
I mean, it actually started in a telephone conversation that Alana and I were having while she was driving, and I was in Johannesburg, she was in Cape Town. We were frustrated with how the property market was working. Alana had just helped somebody purchase a property and was completely flabbergasted by how hard it was, every single step of the way. And then we were also, between the two of us, there's so much anecdotal evidence or commentary about informal transactions and about how the market isn't working, but there was no data. And to go and survey that, there have been a couple studies before that have tried to understand the informal property market and done surveys, but that's actually not real data. You're asking somebody in the abstract, and really the only way to get that information directly is creating an advice office. So it was Ilana's idea to set up an advice office, and literally within weeks you found a place. We didn't have any funding at the time, and then were able to work with the city's support program from National Treasury, and they supported it for the first 7 or 8 months of it, hey? And then there was a long period when there wasn't any funding at all, and that's when 71.4 was funding it directly. Then Tough 21 came in and provided funding, and we received further funding from the MasterCard Foundation for the blockchain project and from the Cities Alliance to start to document it. It's been a difficult project because, it started on a bit of a hunch, and then you just went with it. And through that, I think we've really captured people's imagination. It's seriously hard work.
I can believe it. I mean, Lana, when did the initiative start up?
Well, we started talking about it, I think, in 2017. I mean, the property transaction that I facilitated was actually, it's a security guard at my kid's school, and just sort of chatting to him over the years. I knew he lived in a shack, and come on, let's help you buy a house, we can do something, there's subsidies, let's try this. And it took a long time, and eventually he found a house, and I just sort of funded it in cash, just paid the seller in cash, and then went through the process of retrospectively getting a subsidy and a mortgage for the security guard, who, and I literally picked up documents and dropped them off at the provincial office. I went with him to meetings with the conveyancer and the bond attorney, and I mean, it was outrageous. I mean, that bond attorney meeting, kind of explaining the terms and conditions of this mortgage loan, and so the attorney would say, do you know what prime interest rate is? And he said no. And she said, okay, well, this is a variable rate mortgage, do you know what that is? He said no. And it was like, and the role that I played with him was constantly through the process of just explaining to him what would happen. I remember his first installment went off his mortgage, and he showed me the SMS that he got from the bank, and it said, thank you for your payment of whatever, rand amount, and your current loan balance is X. And he said to me, my loan was for X. I paid off, Y. How come my balance hasn't come down by Y? And sort of just explained to him the bank wasn't stealing from him, but just the structure of a mortgage and the interest in the capital and how that was working. And even today, I drop my kids off, and every morning I say to him, is everything okay? And occasionally he says to me, no, the bank didn't take the money this month.
Right.
And then it's this process of saying to him, look, it's okay. Sometimes there are administrative problems. Just call the call center. I'm sure it's going to be okay. Just that process of having someone to talk to.
Hand-holding, yeah?
Completely. That you cannot, we just assume that you put a product out there, people can use it, you've got a call center, people will phone, they know what's going on, they trust you. It's just not like that, So just sort of being there and kind of watching the process really opened my eyes to how practically impossible this would be for someone who didn't have assistance. Who would be helping someone? So that's why we set it up. Yeah.
You know, Kathy, you talked about how with the subsidy program was crowding out the private sector because the state was building those houses. But what's so fascinating is that those houses now built are actually crowding in the private sector. And that would be such a nice shift if actually government were to notice that and recognize that that's happening. And partly that's because of the value of the property itself. So in the early days, you build something, it takes a while for it to develop value because people have to invest in the neighborhood and it sort of consolidates. But once it does that, it starts to develop a life of its own. And so you've got people who are making investments just on the basis of their own creativity and the opportunity that presents them. And to some extent, they do it, you know, they pull money from different places and out of their back pockets and under the mattress and so on. But eventually that becomes a viable business, and then they're able to approach lenders. And lenders who are seeing that their markets in other segments of the markets have been depressed and have been unable to extend are seeing that this becomes a new opportunity. I mean, that's another paper that Ilana and her team worked on about a year ago, which was about bringing life back to our mortgage market. And that this is a market, people who are new homeowners who have received these assets, and those assets are now starting to perform because the neighborhood is consolidated, that becomes a new market for lenders to lend into. And now those properties can actually start to leverage more credit into the market, which then can be backyard dwellings, or it can be a small business or a B&B or whatever.
So what you're talking to there, if I'm understanding correctly, Kessia, is this idea of transformation of the space, not only in spatial terms but also in economic terms.
Completely.
And that is obviously what we've been driving at since 1994.
And please, let's call that transformation, absolutely, and call it integration, right? So now we've got a whole lot of, we're integrating and consolidating that neighborhood. And historically, we looked at that subsidy neighborhood, we classify it under one category, and it's sort of, we think Smarties box houses, all of those things that people used to call subsidized areas. And now you go and it looks completely different. Every house is completely different with different kinds of investment. I mean, for years I've been remarking how there's building materials on the side of every other house, right? And so that's being changed. But it's not just about consolidating residential space for the household's own use. They're actually leveraging it now to build buildings, and those housing beneficiaries are becoming housing suppliers.
Well, I mean, it's fascinating. We've talked, you know, the whole question of the big players in some of the construction industry seem to have gone under in this last year or so. But here you are talking about almost a phenomenon that's occurring at scale and more at a micro level. And that what that does to the supply is quite an exciting space, not so?
Yeah. No, Paul Jackson from Tough, he calls it massive small. So you've got a massive number of very small projects, and when you put those together, you get a scale that actually you can't even dream of. In a one large scale project will take you years, but if you add 1 + 1 + 1 + 1, you've got a whole lot that's going on.
But it also ties so nicely back to the point you were making, Ilana, around, we're doing a lot of work in other municipalities, and the general discourse is these housing projects are bankrupting us. We don't know how we're going to carry on servicing the rollout of these new housing developments that aren't going to pay rates in the foreseeable future, or will pay for services. And I mean, what you're describing is where it ultimately comes full circle, and these now are functional neighborhoods that could very much become part of the fabric of the functionality of the municipality and local governance. And I think that we don't necessarily think about it in that way, is how are we facilitating and working with these processes, with these townships and these new housing developments to sort of transition over the long term to kind of come into that space. So they're a suburb like every other suburb that's has agency in the governance space.
But isn't it time? It's like 25 years, right?
Yeah.
So it's time for the policy to now evolve. The minister, I know you want to come in, but the minister said on Monday, no more free houses.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, she has said it in different spaces before, but it's in a speech that's printed, and I will go and find the reference to that.
So you heard it first here on this Talking Transformation podcast, right?
So what do you have to fill that space? Well, the state has supported the delivery of a significant entry-level property market, and that can actually lead to, we probably don't need those new houses anymore, because now you've got a market that's going to start to deliver a much wider diversity of stock than the state was ever able to do in the past 25 years.
Yeah, no, just I can't comment on what's happening in other municipalities in the province, but the city of Cape Town is is a major city, and it seems like the commentary on RDP properties is just that we've kind of put them in places where we continue to entrench patterns of spatial exclusion and spatial injustice, and that it's a lost cause. And it might be true in some places. I mean, I have driven around parts of the country and thought to myself, well, why did they build houses here? I mean, what were they thinking? But the city of Cape Town, even parts of the city of Cape Town which are far away from the CBD. I mean, I was in Kraaifontein recently. So Kraaifontein's a place that I would think is pretty far, but it's right next to the Kraaifontein industrial area. And that property market is booming. It's entirely informal at the moment because there isn't, most of the property owners seem to have purchased on the secondary market. I mean, we had a meeting, sort of get in a car, drive around with a loud hailer, call a meeting, and get 100 people, and this is just in one small section of Kraaifontein, so over 100 people come to the meeting. They've all bought properties informally and want to formalize. And why do they want to formalize? Because the property owner who's sitting with a title deed realizes that they can sell the house again, and that's what they do in some cases.
At a profit.
At a huge profit. So you sold the house
Sunday
originally,
Times.
Exactly. You sold the house originally in 2010 for 50,000 Rand. Lo and behold, your neighbor sold a house recently for 150,000 Rand, and so you sell the house again for 150,000 Rand, and the poor person who bought the house in 2010 gets an eviction order. So that word gets out very, very quickly, and people realize, okay, I need the title deed. So there was title originally given to beneficiaries. There's been a sort of degradation of the title through an informal secondary market sale, and now the process that we try and do is to regularize that. And in most cases, actually, the seller is not dishonest, and the seller knows that they sold the property and is happy to sign a deed of sale, and we can actually regularize a lot of those sales. Not all, but a lot.
You're doing that, Ilana, through affidavits and so forth? In the absence of the piece of paper, how are you doing that?
Yeah, so what we've done in Khayelitsha is gone to street committees who would be signing affidavits, and we've asked them for their most recent affidavits, and we contact the seller. So we trace the seller and then ask them if they'll sign a deed of sale. And in many cases, they're happy to sign a deed of sale. And then we can formalize the transaction and send it through to a conveyancer and register it and get a title deed.
So what is the scope then, Ilana, of the project? Because I mean, it sounds like it's an endless. It has no.
Yes.
So realistic. How are you framing your objectives for the transaction centre there in Khayelitsha?
Well, I think our objectives. I mean, we set up and we called it an action learning. Is that what we called it? An action learning initiative, which basically means you open the doors, you don't know what you're doing, and you see what comes through and you try and solve it.
Right.
And so we started over a year ago, and the cases that have come through actually processing them, we've built very good relationships with a lot of very, very good officials in the province and in the city. And so we're getting good at processing a lot of those transactions and can see the opportunity for scale. The front office piece is a requirement. People need a place to go that's accessible. They need a place. It's all about chasing pieces of paper. So you need to bring a piece of paper to someone. You need to physically sign a deed of sale in front of a conveyancer. All of those things have to be done. But that's the front office piece, and I think that's quite easy to set up a series of offices in key locations around the city. The back office, kind of setting up the relationships, that's the hard work. And I think we've done a lot of that. There are still a couple of key relationships that we're still trying to build, and then a couple of key pieces of policy that are just completely missing, that make it very difficult for us to do our work. So that's something that we try and engage with. But certainly scalability, it's there. It will require resources, I mean, this is a mess, and you've got to clean it up. So it's not trivial, but it can be done.
But is there scope actually for this to become a private sector or small business opportunity for people to kind of act as facilitators to help with this?
There could be some aspects to it, and we've thought about this. I mean, I think where the private sector might be willing to fund things is really if we could maybe work with the lenders. So for instance, we still get properties where a valuer will go to a property and tell us they see no value. And it's just like, are you joking? There's a backyard here. We can see you can put, 6 rental units here, and you're coming back and telling us there's no value. That's probably because you mostly work in Camps Bay. So how do you get the valuers who are familiar with the dynamics of a local market, so that valuation service, management of properties, so a first-time home buyer who's got a mortgage and doesn't know anyone else who's got a mortgage and has never had a mortgage before, starts to get into trouble. You really need to support them. You need to help them, and you need to be there. Don't tell someone to phone a call center and then they're on hold for 20 minutes or whatever it is. So somewhere for people to go. If the property does become a property in possession, it needs to be sold. So all of those services are possible to provide to lenders. In terms of charging the property owner, the difficulty that we face there is that the costs already are so high. So we have worked very hard with 2 conveyancers, Norton Rose and Abrams and Goss, who basically provide their services for free. And they charge R1,000 for disbursements on a title deed. I think it would be very uncomfortable for a profit-making entity to be charging for their services, expecting other professionals to be taking significant haircuts of what they're charging. So I think until such time as we've got rid of paper and we've really streamlined the transfer process, the property transfer process, I'm not sure that there is a material business case. But having said that, it's worth it. It's worth it for a city. If we can regularise the one case where there's a 42,000 Rand arrears account on the account that's outstanding, if we can regularise a property like that and get someone who's not paying to pay, we have paid for that service probably within 3 months. So I think there's a real business case. Should the city be funding it? Look, there's a lot of money in the title restoration program. That's 1.6 billion rands that Treasury's made available over the next 3 years. There's a lot of legwork. I'm not sure that this is something that the property owner can pay for.
It's interesting we're talking a lot about the paper trail and this sort of almost archaic situation of, I'm looking at the cell phone on the table here and I'm saying, isn't there an app? What role, if anything, do you think, Kessia, does technology play in making this more available, accessible, quicker? Is there a role?
Well, absolutely. And especially where you're talking about, the very first property transaction that you ever facilitated was one where the price of the transfer was 10% of the property value, and then the price of the bond registration was another 10%. 10% total of the 2 of them together. But that's huge. Especially with low value properties, the cost of the traditional mechanism for going through the transfer process and the bond registration becomes a significant proportion of that property value. And that's just, it's not tenable actually, because you're working with households who have entered into this market without an income, and they may have an income now, but in any event, in relation to the property, it's insufficient.
Yeah, we in the process of doing this sort of blockchain pilot, which has been fascinating. So just to create a blockchain-based property register of properties in our area, the pilot sites that we've selected around the Transaction Support Centre, it's about 1,000 properties, none of which have ever had primary transfer. And we've gone through the process of collecting the data, and we're now putting that data on a blockchain-based ledger. And the wonderful thing about that is occupancy surveys. It's the first step that you have to do when you regularise, or even if you're going to do an informal settlement upgrading, you have to do an occupancy survey. Where does that data go? It's sitting on someone's laptop on a spreadsheet. It never gets updated, so if you don't act on that data within the next couple of months, it goes stale and you've got to do it all over again.
Sure.
So what we're doing is we've collected the data. We're working closely with city officials who've been fantastic to transfer those properties that can be transferred. Where there's no impediment to transfer, let's go and transfer them. Might even take a couple of months even with those properties, but for all the properties, keep the data up to date so the property owners know if they put in a tenant, come and tell us. We can have a rental agreement that we can put on the blockchain. It's there, it's secure, so that if something happens and there's another person who comes around and says, I need to know who owns this property, you're not at risk of your tenant saying, I own the property, and having the property transferred into their name. Or if somebody dies, that's a major issue. The beneficiary dies, we need to know. So come in, register, tell us this person has passed away, show us the death certificate, then we can regularize. So I think the technology piece is critical. We can only take it so far in the current. The Electronic Deeds Registry Act that has been passed, but for that to be implemented, who knows? No one's holding their breath, and we don't really know what that's going to do. But going forward, South Africa, it's actually we've got a fantastic base to work off in that we've got digital IDs in the country. So citizens have IDs, and those are biometrically verifiable. So you can actually verify the identity of someone with a fingerprint. We've got these smart cards. You can build a very, very robust property management system off the back of that. And all the literature that you read about blockchain solutions, they'll all say starts with a digital ID. If you've got that, you can. So we could strip out paper entirely from this process. And because we can verify identities digitally, we can strip out notaries and conveyancers. And I'm sure they'll be very upset to hear this. But that process, that purpose, what does a conveyancer do? A conveyancer verifies that the person is who they say they are and that they own the property that they say they own. Those functions, if you've digitized things properly, can be automated to a large degree. So there's enormous potential. It's just a question of getting all the parties, and unfortunately most of them are in government, to speak to each other and to prioritize this. So I think the Home Affairs Department is absolutely crucial to this. The Department of Justice is crucial. So it's not just rural development and land reform, which sits with the deeds registry. It's a whole lot of other government entities that really have to partner.
What we're talking about right now actually sort of gets to a bigger picture issue that I'd like to bring us to, if that's okay. A fundamental point of the relationship between the citizen and the state is the property on which they live. That is basically about how our whole governance system is structured around that. That creates the municipality, and then it goes. So your ability, and whether you're a tenant or you're an owner of that property, your relationship to that property, you live on a property that is part of a city, and that property is the thing that connects you to the city, and then the title deed is the thing that frames that creates a legal parameter. That is the thing that you can hold, that everyone can hold and look on and say, we agree that this person is in this place and this place is related to this city. So the title deed is really that fulcrum, that point of connection between the citizen and the state. And if they're a tenant, then it's the lease agreement that then connects to the title deed. So we've got properties across this city, across very many cities, where either there is no title has ever been transferred, and that's been a failure of the state, and the state's acknowledged that, and they need to address it. Then we've got other properties where a title deed has been issued, but people who were living there were either unable to access the formal system or impatient with it, or they didn't really respect it because it wasn't really working for them, and that might have been because those properties weren't worth anything at the time. As that's starting to change, you now have a situation where for very many properties, that relationship between the city and the state has been broken. And it hasn't worked functionally.
Understood.
If we can use technology to create that connection, there's a level of efficiency that is so exciting for me, because it starts to then make it possible, as Alana said right at the beginning of this conversation, for the city to somehow relate to the person, their customer, through that property. And so what I get really excited about with the blockchain project is that it's almost like creating stepping stones, where you've got a completely informal situation on the one hand, and on the other hand you have a formal title that you would expect and you imagine in terms of our world-class cadastral system. And that the blockchain creates stepping stones of levels of formality depending on how you describe your relationship to a property. And in the absence of that formal system having worked for that particular citizen on that particular property, we can start to name and frame the relationship of the citizen to the state through the blockchain initiative. And over time, as we start to build trust around that, that's what then makes it possible for other actors to also start to engage, the lenders and other service providers and so on.
There's another aspect to that, isn't it? It's about the data you start to generate and, the big data. I mean, a few years ago, CAF did, I think you were involved too, Alana, in the housing market profiles of the big cities. And in fact, some of the smaller cities, the mining towns as well. I think you did housing market profiles. And I mean, I think this is sort of working from the bottom up. It starts to add much more depth and richness to our understanding of what's going on in the we've got big data on the formal market, but starting to add data on the semi-formal or the informal market. And I think, it would be really useful for you to describe, so you've described that sort of relationship with the individual and the state, but I also think it's useful to think about how does all this information we have actually help government, particularly municipalities, to better understand the housing market in order to be far more targeted or to build an argument for why one should invest in a particular space like transactions, because the scale of the benefit might justify that. It'd be really useful if you could reflect on that kind of from a perspective of why is it important and what's understanding our housing market as kind of public sector officials, because I don't think we've typically been trained to think too hard about it.
I mean, I can just comment on the entry-level market and just the experience that we had working with city-level data on RDP properties. And I think the most interesting thing that we found was that the city had no idea how many RDP properties were in the city. So it depended which data set you were looking at. And again, possibly it's because it's probably a good thing that we don't know whether a property is an RDP property or not, because that would probably, some official would probably want to then control what gets done with that RDP property. So just as well, no one knows. But just from a paying attention to a neighborhood, what we noticed with, for instance, the valuations department, I mean, that's often the engine of why the city will have data, because the valuations department needs the data to value a property, because you need data to create a valuation model. So when it came to low value properties that fell below that threshold, that rates threshold, the valuation department didn't care. And we're very honest with us to say, look, it's not really our interest. RDP houses, fall below that threshold, so we're not interested. And so we don't really, thanks for telling us that our data is really bad, but it makes no difference to us. So as soon as you start to bring visibility to the fact that a lot of properties in the neighborhood are above or approaching that valuation threshold, and actually they've all got DSTV dishes, and actually they probably could pay property rates, if you bothered to build them and collect the money, So there is I think that kind of just bringing that visibility that I think we all so used to just writing off neighborhoods. This is an RDP area. There's no value here. No one here has got any money, and so this is just the unfunded mandate that we have, and just this is the way life's going to be. Unfortunately, we just have to pay for services here. That's just not true. I think the data would really help. Just that point, bring that point across.
And change the way in which the city then responds to those areas, because if those areas are revenue generating areas rather than revenue draining areas, you can deliver services in those areas
in a different way.
And absolutely. And then you can start to support a governance framework, and you can, you invest in the urban infrastructure that supports that housing. And of course, when that starts happening, the people in the neighborhood are like, this is a cool area to live, and we're going to start investing more in our properties. And that's a level of property improvement that we actually want. And then what you then get to have is in those areas that we've been writing off as RDP areas, you've got them, they become diverse income and diverse value areas.
And is that where we start to see financial institutions becoming very interested in that space?
Completely, because they're interested in that property ladder. Because when they sell, when they provide a bond for a mortgage, right, and somebody buys a house, well, the person who sold it, that seller is a potential buyer for something else. So for every transaction, they've got two clients that they can start working with.
And that data brings visibility to the potential. I mean, you guys have also done work on a rental housing index, which starts to show, where people are renting and concentrations of rental behavior in municipalities or in towns, which starts to show potential for demand, and particularly where actually social housing institutions and others might want to go in, or be encouraged or facilitated or enabled to go in to start meeting that demand too.
Yeah, I think that rental piece is really interesting. But just to comment that the direction of causality is not rising property prices to make officials aware to pay attention to an area. I think the direction of causality is city officials become aware, they pay attention to an area, property prices rise. So I think that's just to start thinking about that. And again, the data would probably help us uncover these relationships. We took a few city officials to the Transaction Support Centre a few weeks ago and stopped in at a property that was really, really beautifully built. And right next door to this beautiful property was a shibby. Really offends my middle class sensibilities that there's a shebeen right in a residential area that is open till after 11 every night, and we asked the property owner, what's it like living next to a shebeen, and she said, look, it's just terrible. I mean, I'm not going to tell you what she said, but it's pretty awful. And I turned to a city official and said, come on guys, I mean, really, isn't it time to start saying you can't have a shebeen in this area? And the comment back was actually, might be difficult to say that, but certainly we could rate this property as a business premises, and the property rates would go up. And then if the business owner didn't pay those rates, we would switch off the water. And then once the water's switched off, you're not allowed to operate the shebeen. So we make it less attractive for people to run shebeens in certain areas. And possibly we might even want to have incentives for business owners to locate on a high street. So it's kind of those more basic governance functions that if the city thought about what creates property value and what stimulates investments and what's our role in that, to have that thought process first might result in faster outcomes, faster results.
So here we are back to this idea of it's not just about the property and the building on top, but the precinct and that neighborhood and the management of that and the governance framework that supports that.
Absolutely. And that's what then makes those areas desirable areas and investable areas, and starts to support. We have an inclusionary housing policy that is being promoted in this city, and in other cities they're looking at that as well. And that inclusionary policy is about bringing low-income people into high-value areas mostly. But I think we certainly have to do it also in the other direction, and look at it in terms of bringing higher income people into lower income areas, because those areas are growing in value, so that you have a diversity of residents in all neighborhoods.
If we start to bring the conversation to a sort of summary, we started, Kessie, you talked about the idea of property is typically thought about on a Sunday Times supplement property, pull it out, look at that's the market. And what we've explored here is that there's a whole range of another market that's functioning that's not on that Sunday Times supplement. Do you foresee a time in the future where the Sunday Times will be looking at this space? Is that, would that be a mark of success, or do you think it's irrelevant of how it gets done in that space? This thing is, or at the scale, the replication of it, it's doing its own thing.
No, for sure. In 2003, when we first looked at township residential property markets, and we surveyed 2,000 households, and we asked them about how they found their house, or how did people find houses, it was all by word of mouth. There was no information, which then means is that if I don't know, if there isn't a space to advertise, then there isn't any competition for the transaction, which means that neither the buyer nor the seller are actually able to realize the value that they could realize. So as there is more churn that's happening, people will start to advertise their properties, because then they can make those properties available and recognizable by a wider array of buyers. And then that will start to create a competition. And being able to do that through the technology piece becomes so much more efficient. Printing it in a newspaper, that may, in fact, be too expensive. but you've got other forms already. Property 24, Gumtree,
Sure.
are people advertising their properties there. What we need is for those kinds of mechanisms not to be the shorthand for an informal transaction. I mean, so many of those transactions that are advertised are saying cash only sale. It's not clear if those are going to be formal. You've been calling some of those to establish. And what we want to demonstrate through the Transaction Support Center is that formal transactions, besides being good in the long term, are actually, they should be easy in the short term. It should be the default mechanism. It should be the easy way to transact. And that's really what the Transaction Support Center is trying to achieve, is to make it so easy that it becomes the normal way of doing things.
But you also get better returns, don't you? I think you've cited an example, Alana, of a sort of an informal transaction that you tried to formalize, and when the previous owner discovered what the actual value was, suddenly was perhaps slightly less cooperative in regularizing.
Yeah, and that's that's the pattern. So people have sold the house 5 years ago and then go, wow, sold it for 50,000, it's worth 200,000. That was a blunder.
If they hadn't gone, if they'd gone through the formal.
And I think that it's not trivial to shift that, because I think the sellers are often very liquidity constrained and want cash quickly. And when you say to a seller, just hang on for 2 months, 3 months, the buyer needs a mortgage, needs a subsidy, it's going to take some time, they typically will go and find a cash buyer. And that's been fascinating for us, just how many cash buyers there are in the market. And when we ask the estate agents where the money comes from, it's often from an employer. So there's someone providing finance. Sometimes there's a loan, an unsecured loan. We have to fight hard to get a sale because we're competing against cash.
If you had to change one thing on policy, Kessia, what would that be?
I want to take a step back before to say that, we have a policy in which actually most things should be possible. But we have a communication that suggests that houses can't be ever sold. So right now we've got a resale restriction of 8 years. It'd be very nice to take that one away and to replace it with consumer education and support and information and market transparency.
Right.
Because then you would have people reacting to the dynamics of a market and engaging. The 8-year resale restriction that's in the Housing Act was put there because they wanted to prevent downward rating. Fair enough. That may well be an issue. We can't protect everyone from that, and I think what we've done instead is created a much bigger problem where people are incentivized to transact informally. But worse than that is the conversations that come, the pronouncements that selling properties, that transacting in a resale market is not allowed. So there is a real market misinformation where people think that it's illegal to sell your house at all, and that's just not true. It's perfectly legal to sell your house. There's just a restriction on time.
The concept of downward rating, just for the listeners.
So the thought was that if somebody is given a house for free, and it's in a desirable area and it's a nice house, somebody who doesn't qualify for that but who can't buy another house somewhere else may come and say, I'll give you some money for this, and then they'll buy it from them. And then you'll have middle class people crowding out poor people. And that may well happen, but you can manage that differently than just saying it's not allowed, because saying it's not allowed is in fact a false rule.
Understood.
People will do it anyway.
Ilana, from your side, anything from a policy perspective? If you could press one thing and say, change this, what would it be?
Well, I can just talk to a major gap that's causing us some sleepless nights at the moment, and that is we don't really know how to deal with disputes properly.
Right.
And in fact, it's actually not a gap in policy as much as a lack of willingness, or I think it's political, the political leadership to really push this. So what we're looking at on the blockchain pilot is we might have cases of dispute. How do we mediate that? So we can have an information gathering process. We can accumulate evidence. At the end of the day, we need someone to adjudicate the dispute. Who is that someone? Well, we don't know. So the city's got a mediation process, but it's not binding. And, what will happen? I mean, there is, the Land Title Adjustment Act, which is a regulation that exists in South Africa, which allows the Minister of Rural Development and Land Reform to appoint a commissioner in an area to adjudicate disputes. And actually that commissioner is a judge and can award a property, can sign a deed of sale, can change a general plan, has all the powers they need to resolve any kind of land-related dispute. And, we went to see the department in January, and basically they turned around and said to us, look, we're not here to clean up the mess created by the Human Settlements Department. Which was, okay, fair enough, it's true, but we do have a mess and someone has to clean it up. And it's been impossible to get any traction with them. Leslie Downey, who's a very well-known and very well-respected academic and conveyancer, put together a whole sort of proposal for a commissioner. I think it was in the Overstrand district. Got as far as identifying the commissioner, and then the Department of Rural Development just pulled the plug on it for no reason. No one understands why. So it's just this kind of, I suppose it's, just maybe the political will to really tackle this problem and do what we need to do that's procedurally fair, that's transparent, to enable end-to-end resolution of this mess that we've got.
But you know what, I'm sorry, but what that means is that we actually have to change our notion of what the housing program is about. And that again gets back to the fact that we're 25 years in now. So when we started in 1994, there were no houses. We had to build them, and we had to build them really fast. There are houses now. When we started then, there weren't any developers that were building in that market. There are developers now. The whole sector's diversified with a completely different housing sector. And so now's the space in which we can actually start to trust the fact that the market is working. And it's working not just with big fancy companies, but also with very small, sometimes individually owned businesses, small scale entrepreneurs who are participating in building a market and working with this great asset that the state has built, the stock of entry-level housing. But the state needs to shift its sense of what its job is. And it's about facilitating the functioning of the market, literally by making the regulations work, or by creating space so that the private sector and individuals themselves can actually engage in the ways that they want and find opportunities and pursue those. That's a completely different mindset to we're going to build 1 million houses in 5 years, which I think we're still echoing.
The quantum.
Yeah.
Ilana, where can people find out more about the work that you're doing there at the Transaction Centre?
I think just, either CAF's website or our website. I think if you Google Transaction Support Centre, you're probably likely to hit us. We've written up case studies, we've got some presentations. We're physically located in the Desmond Tutu Recreation Centre in Makaza. There's a wonderful, wonderful city library called the Nazima Isaacs Library. We're right next door to that library. If people who are listening to this need assistance or know people who need assistance, please direct people to the centre. Our details are online. Otherwise, just contact me at 71.4.com, and we certainly do our best to assist.
And Kesia, in terms of the CAF, the Centre for Affordable Housing Finance, where can people find out more about the work that you're doing there?
We're on housingfinanceafrica.org. And if anyone has questions about title deeds and properties and so on, in fact, it doesn't have to be limited to Khayelitsha. Increasingly, we're starting to look at other areas as well. And at least we'd like to know about them so that we can get a sense about where these are being expressed. We'd love to hear from that. So that's my email or web address. Take a look there.
Now, there are an amazing range of fascinating papers into all sorts of angles in the housing sector on your website. So it's really worth a visit. Yeah.
Well, Ilana, Kesia, thank you so much for hosting Kathy and I today. We really appreciate your time, your insights. I think you've challenged a lot of preconceptions that people may have around the whole housing market, particularly in that affordable space. I think there was a lot of lessons learned, and it's clear there's a lot of work to be done. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Thanks so much. It was a nice discussion.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please engage with us and let us know your thoughts on this episode. You can do so via the Anchor podcast platform. There's a voice message function available via the app. You can also follow us on Twitter via Talking Transfo and the number 1. So Talking Transfo 1. Our theme music is kindly made available by Tribal Need. Find out about the music, street art shows here in Cape Town and Europe via tribalneed.com.